Good afternoon. It's Friday the 3rd of March 2023, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Had to think about that for a second. Uh, Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen, as usual. Thank you very much for joining us, Patrick.
Fabulous TGI Fridays, Mike.
It is indeed. And we've got Vanessa Beeley from Damascus, as usual, on a Friday. Welcome, Vanessa. We're going to get straight on here with, a bit of lighthearted news to begin with today, because we start with heavy stuff often. But let's start off with...
And apologies in advance to the viewers. We're going to be showing you some disturbing images. So we're just sorry about that in advance.
So here you go. Here he is, Matt Hancock, and the Guardian's coverage here from Wednesday. Ministers rally behind COVID inquiry after Hancock WhatsApp revelations. So the reason I chose this article was because it had the image, the header image with Matt Hancock and his ghostwriter Isabel Oakeshott with his book that was published in December. Unfortunately, what seems to, let's just bring the Waterstones ad up. Other bookshops do exist, of course. Pandemic Diaries, the inside stories of Britain's battle against COVID. This is how he was trying to present himself. So the question is, let's start off by asking, who is Isabel Oakeshott? Well, of course, she is a journalist for many years, but has also written a number of books, including this one. Isabel Oakeshott runs squealing from David Cameron's Piggate claims. This was Call Me Dave. She was ghostwriting this for Lord Ashcroft. And of course, there was the allegation that David Cameron had been doing strange things with the heads of pigs while he was at Oxford. So anyway, she has published today a statement on the WhatsApp messages. And she says, hard though it may be for him to believe, this isn't about Matt Hancock or indeed any other individual politician, nor is it about me. The greatest betrayal is of the entire country. We were all let down by the response to the pandemic and repeated unnecessary lockdowns. Children in particular paid a terrible price. Anyone who questioned an approach we now know was fatally flawed was utterly vilified, including highly respected and eminent public health experts, doctors and scientists. So far from being protected, the NHS may never recover, as millions of patients condemned to year-long waiting lists are discovering. Meanwhile, the economy is in smithereens. It's now essential that the public inquiry, set up almost 2 years ago, quickly establishes deadlines for its work and answers the urgent questions about whether lockdown, with all its impacts, was proportionate. These issues must be addressed well before the next general election. Against this backdrop, the Telegraph expose is clearly in the overwhelming public interest. The outpouring of support I and the paper have had from ordinary people who suffered and are still suffering the consequences of the mistakes we were exposing shows how desperately the nation wants answers. I make no apology whatsoever for acting in the national interest. The worst betrayal of all would be to cover up these truths. So that was what she was saying today. But I want to draw everybody's, before I get your comments on this, I want to draw everybody's attention to an article she published in The Spectator in December at the time the book was being released. This was it, The Truth About Matt Hancock. This is what she had to say. The passage of time has not left me any less angry about lockdowns. My blood still boils when I think of the unnecessary suffering, the broken homes, broken businesses, the lost moments with loved ones, the missed cancers and operations, a generation of children scarred forever. The country paid a catastrophic price as each day passes. More evidence emerges that shutting down society for prolonged periods to stop the spread and protect the NHS was a monumental disaster. And then she went on to talk about Hancock himself. In the event, she said, Hancock shared far more than I could ever have imagined. I viewed thousands of sensitive government communications relating to the pandemic, a fascinating and very illuminating exercise. So really, this was published in December. Patrick, it should be no surprise, therefore, that when she was given that kind of access, that this was probably what was going to happen, particularly based on her prior coverage of other Tory MPs, including David Cameron. She went on to say, Hancock, Whitty and Johnson knew full well that non-medical face masks do very little to prevent transmission of the virus. People were made to wear them anyway because Dominic Cummings was fixated with them, because Nicola Sturgeon liked them, and above all because they were symbolic of public health emergency. And I think that's the point that we were making from the very beginning. But then she goes on to say, given the unprecedented speed at which vaccine was developed, the government might have been expected to be extra careful about recording and analysing any reported side effects. While there was much anxiety about potential adverse reactions during clinical trials, once it passed regulatory hurdles, which it didn't actually, but never mind that, ministers seemed to stop worrying. In early January 2021, Hancock casually asked Chris Whitty, where are we up to on the system for monitoring events after rollout? I was told, there's another quote, I was told we were doing it, but I worry that the details will be shonky. Hancock is supposed to have told Whitty, sounding as if it was a bit of an afterthought. So that's the kind of coverage. But this, I thought, was an interesting point from this article as well. Such was the fear of anti-vaxxers that the Cabinet Office used a team hitherto dedicated to tackling ISIS propaganda to curb their influence. The zero-tolerance approach extended to dissenting doctors and academics. The eminent scientists behind the so-called Barrington Declaration, which argued that public health efforts should focus on protecting the most vulnerable while allowing the general population to build up natural immunity to the virus, were widely vilified. Hancock genuinely considered their views a threat to public health. So I don't know what your thoughts are on this. I mean, as I see it, this could be just a pathetic attempt to sell more books. It could be some kind of effort to divert attention away from Boris and Whitty and Valence and so on. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, in this economy, Mike, I don't know who would want to spare 25 quid on something that really should be used to heat their homes during this rough winter. But look, the thing that puzzles me about Isabel Oakeshott is why would she want to align her name as a co-author with somebody with such a damaged brand like Matt Hancock? I mean, he's right up there with Tony Blair in terms of, you know, the national scorn, the hate. They like to see the back of this guy's career. Nobody is as unpopular as Matt Hancock. I think that's why he was dumped, right, as health secretary. But so that puzzles me a little bit.
To suspend your disbelief, it gave her access to those thousands of communications. Is that what it was about?
It could be, yeah. And so if that's the case, then I could see the method in her madness. But still, she's going to be on the shelves there as co-author next to that man. So I think, you know, if this story didn't break, Mike, that book would be in the clearance section right next to Harry's Spare, which they're giving away at W.H. Smith now, 50% off if you spend more than 20 pounds or something like that. So, yeah, I mean.
Vanessa, have you any thoughts on this?
No, only really that it kind of either does she know that something else is going to come out about Hancock further down the line, so she's protecting her own derriere right now, or is Hancock being put forward as a fall guy for someone else, either currently or in the future? That's what it kind of, it just smells of a bit of an op for me. Not that I particularly care if Hancock is the fall guy, because he thoroughly deserves it. But that's what it seems like to me. Or as I said, she has inside knowledge that something else is going to come out and hit him in the future, and she wants to distance herself.
Yeah, exactly. I think Vanessa's onto something there. I don't know what her relationship is with Boris Johnson, friendly or not, or political allies.
Right.
Who knows? But certainly anything to take the pressure off Boris, because I still think that there are big plans for Boris, Mike. I don't know exactly what they are. Is it a seat running NATO? Is it a return back to the head of the Tory high table? What do you think that might be?
Who knows?
But there might be a future for Boris.
He still sees himself as having a future. But anyway, let's move on, and let's move on to Ukraine then, Patrick.
So here we go. Just a little update here on what's going on in Ukraine. We've got the splash image up here, of course. This is really what it's all about. It's about the photo ops here. The one on the lower left-hand corner is particularly disturbing. We won't harp on that too much, but that's really what it's become. At this point, it's just becoming so farcical now. And you can see the media, especially in the United States, are beginning to turn. This Ukraine fatigue is really, really setting in. And people are saying, well, and not only that, the audit calls are coming from the Republican Congress now. And so this is big trouble here for Europe, because Europe's really going to be caught in the middle of this. You know, how long can you sustain this proxy war? Right. This is the big question. So a little bit of movement here, though, on the negotiations talks. The G20 in Indonesia, Mike. You've got Sergei Lavrov and Tony Blinken. They managed to get together for 10 minutes. Okay, that might not seem like much, but it's something. This is a start. This is the first time I believe that these two have spoken to each other since the hostilities began last late February 2022. So they did reiterate that they both are not in agreement on anything, and I believe even Lavrov got up and walked out during one point with, I think it was a German delegation, were making accusations at Russia. So all in all, this was a very uncomfortable exchange. However, there's some progress here because at least they talked. So this might be perhaps, prelude to something else. So that's good news, I think. I'll take that as a positive. But Zelensky might have overstepped the bounds a little bit. Okay, so he was holding court on one of these sort of highly produced stage panel things. He seems to be doing more media than he is doing anything else. I guess they're in a war, supposedly, maybe not in Kiev. But so Biden's left last week, and so Zelensky. So he made a comment here about what is going to happen if we don't support Ukraine with more money and weapons in perpetuity. But listen to this.
The U.S. will have to send their sons and daughters exactly the same way as we are sending their sons and daughters to war, and they will have to fight because it's NATO that we're talking about, and they will be dying, God forbid, because it's a horrible thing.
I don't think so.
No.
Not going to happen. Okay, so the Dwarf King has overstepped the mark big time. There's a huge backlash from this. So he's doing the old neocon talking point. We need to fight. You got to fight them over here, the Russians, so you don't have to fight them over at home, sort of thing. And so he's basically saying that you're going to end up fighting the Russians if you don't back us to the hilt forever. Right. Basically, total. Like, where's the end of this conflict? And this is what people are asking now. What's the exit strategy? The first time you're hearing people talk about an exit strategy in the United States. So I think if that's where we're at now in March, I think as the months progress, Mike, the campaigning for the 2024 presidential election begins officially in April. That's next month. So this subject will be at the top of the list. So whichever candidate occupies the high ground on Ukraine, the popular ground, the populist ground, you know what the populist position is on this war?
Yeah.
It's get out, basically. So the media won't be able to do too much because I think the people are going to speak on this. So I think that you're going to see some movement on this. I don't know how and what it's going to be, but Biden administration in a very, very tight corner increasingly on this.
Okay, but what about Bakhmut then?
So Bakhmut, you reported on this earlier in the week with UK Column, a little update here. So this turned up here on Ukrainian and Russian Telegram here on the eve of the final abandonment of Bakhmut. The armed forces of Ukraine began large-scale mining of buildings. TM62M anti-tank mines are used as explosives, intersections, and tank hazardous areas in the city and its surroundings. So this has been validated. These mines have been delivered and supplied to the Ukrainian forces. I've seen other videos of this. So, but this is what we're doing with our money, Mike. We're mining the country. And I don't have to tell you, and nobody listening should be under any illusions of the dangers that these mines pose to people years and years after the conflict. They're still cleaning these up in Lebanon. They will be cleaning them up in Syria. They'll be cleaning up in Afghanistan and still in Iraq, okay? Absolute terrible policy by NATO to supply these and to pay for them as well. So, I mean, this should be a question on the floor of the House of Commons. Why on earth are we pumping so much money into this war and then landmines? It's incredible. In an area where they're losing, clearly the Ukrainian armed forces are being driven out. Right. So it's crazy. Right. And what about Poland then? Well, this is the big takeaway here, Mike. So increasingly, this is a really good piece by French human rights lawyer Arnaud Develay. And he's saying Poland is now angling to become Washington's most reliable partner in Europe. This is a very, very important point going on here. Okay, so if there's no military victory to be had in Ukraine by the United States and NATO, then what will be the consolation prize? And according to this author, the consolation prize is to push the Iron Curtain, the new Iron Curtain, further east, so Poland becomes the new sort of permanent footprint for the United States militarily and NATO, and that goes with all the other bells and whistles, not just troops, but also missile defense and other assets, okay? So Poland is now being strong-armed and given a lot of money, by the way, by Western governments, by NATO, by the United States. And so certain people are being promoted in the Polish political hierarchy who are on board with this agenda. So this would be the takeaway, this would be the win, as well as NATO expansion, a la Finland and Hungary, which I believe we'll touch on.
Oh, we will touch on.
We'll touch on a
I
bit.
mean, what I'd say about this is going to create quite a lot of reaction from the Polish public, because the U.S. has been moving material and arms into and through Poland in order to get to Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and so on for many years. And local populations have had real problems with U.S. servicemen in their areas. So the U.S. being there is already deeply unpopular with the public, but it's the government continues to pursue this policy.
In the reports that we're getting, Mike, from a lot of activists and people I know personally, is that the censorship in Poland with Facebook and social media, the pressure from the Polish government on social media platforms to censor is huge. And so in terms of free speech, that's something that's being, these talking points and this agenda is being heavily enforced by the Polish state. They're meeting people, there's been arrests, door knocks, morning raids, and things like that. So the peace movement in Poland is being suppressed, as is any criticism of NATO. So it is quite heavy-handed. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence now, if you look at social media on this, and there's a lot of people talking about it. Where's that pressure coming from? Washington?
Yeah.
Good question.
Good question. What about Serbia?
So this is another key sort of sideshow that is becoming more and more in focus. Okay, so the EU and the US have been, especially this week, this is an older article, but this really illustrates the issue really well. But last week, the EU issued their sort of memorandum to Serbia, or early this week, late last week. And so there's a lot of pressure to accept or recognize Kosovo as some sort of a deal or quid pro quo. And there's President Vučić there. And so the pressure's coming, and this is a politically difficult issue for Serbia, okay, for a number of different reasons. So that I don't know if we have an additional slide on this. Yeah, so we thought we'd pull this one up here. I believe this is a little bit of a correction here. So this is Ursula von der Leyen, and they've sort of fixed it here. The recognition of two separatist territories, in Serbia is a blatant violation of international law. You can see they're pastiching Ukraine here. And they've basically substituted everything that Ursula von der Leyen is saying about Ukraine with Serbia and Kosovo, and it's actually correct. So this is the problem that NATO, the EU, and the West are in, is they pretty much like destroyed the Helsinki final act, Mike, which was that no borders will move after World War II. The borders are fixed, but we destroyed that with the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, and then creating, worse than that, they've created a NATO protectorate in the middle of Europe, which is called Kosovo, which all of the people, not all the countries around want to recognize. So this is a big problem. Right. So they're really trying to force the issue now, because they have to resolve this, because if the EU, the United States, NATO don't resolve this Kosovo issue, it's a thorn in their side, and it's a complete example of hypocrisy, because they then can't enforce this line they're having now in Crimea. Victoria Nuland and Washington taking a hard line on Crimea, saying this is unilateral secession, this cannot stand in the rules-based international order. And Kosovo is like a giant wart or a boil on Europe that Russia can just come along and pop at any moment. In the literary sense, Mike, it's so hypocritical. So this is the conundrum they're in, and there's no escape. They can't wash away the sins of the Yugoslavian war, and this is why the West will have struggle to have credibility going forward, trying to enforce this sanctimonious line on Crimea and Donbass.
Yeah, indeed. Right, well, let's look at one sanctimonious individual who, of course, is Jens Stoltenberg. He was in, as we reported earlier in the week, he was in Finland on Tuesday. Next week, he's in Sweden, and he's absolutely determined to try and get the expansion of NATO on its way. But he's got two problems. First of all, as we know, he's got the problem with Turkey. And in fact, Turkey not even prepared to accept supporting sanctions. So this is the Turkish foreign minister day before yesterday saying, it's not about Russia. We also don't support sanctions against Iran or any other country. I noticed he didn't mention Syria there. But the point is, he's saying they will not join in unilateral sanctions unless they're supported or backed by the United Nations. They're not going to get involved. They're also not supporting Sweden and Finland joining at the moment. Joining NATO, but they're not alone, because Viktor Orban has moved into the fray as well. And he's saying that while we support Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO in principle, we first need to have serious discussions. And so this is now being discussed.
Yeah.
He's now being discussed in the Parliament, and in fact, the vote has been pushed back, as you say. So it's very unclear at this stage what Hungary is going to agree with respect to this, but they are still finding that Sweden and Finland joining NATO a pretty contentious issue.
Yes, this is a tough one. This is a tough one. So what's going to happen, there's a lot of calls in America right now to kick Turkey out of NATO over this very issue. So this could be an existential or organizational issue for NATO itself if they don't resolve this.
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know how this is going to go, but it's very interesting.
We'll see how it goes. Now, Vanessa, let's bring you on for your main report and continuing to look at Syria and sanctions.
Basically, what I'm looking at today are the way that the US and the UK, who, by the way, have not delivered any one package of humanitarian aid to the 80% of the Syrian population under the Syrian government protection, and are instead, as I said last week, totally focused on the northwest, which is controlled by Al-Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the current branding under the control of Abu Muhammad Jolani. So this is a resolution 132, responding to the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria on February the 6th, 2023. It was brought in by Republican Joe Wilson. I just want to look at the wording, and there's quite a lot in here, but the sheer hypocrisy of the House of Representatives when you consider the thousands of deaths, the thousands of destroyed homes, and even further homes to be destroyed in Latakia, where I was, which is on the Mediterranean coast of Syria, and I was there last weekend. 805 deaths, more than 1,100 injuries, 61 still in hospital, many of those, of course, amputees or serious injuries. Thousands of houses that were destroyed by the sort of double tap earthquake, and others that have to be condemned because they're now unsafe. So there are thousands of families throughout Syria, including the northwest, that are living completely displaced and homeless right now. So let's look at this so-called resolution. So first of all, of course, they mourn the horrific loss of life in Turkey and Syria, express their deep condolences to the families of the many earthquake victims. And here we start. I mean, this is quite incredible. Even a House of Representatives resolution starts almost immediately by promoting the MI6 CIA white helmets. So here we have applauds the heroic work of humanitarian aid and rescue workers on the ground to save lives and provide care for victims. including United States Agency for International Development, urban search and rescue teams. Well, that's the white helmets. And that, in fact, in this one sentence, they give them sort of multiple monikers as if to draw attention to them even more. The armed forces of the United States, which, by the way, are occupying the northeast of Syria and yet didn't come to the help of the Syrian people. And as we know, to the contrary, they're sent ISIS terrorists to attack civilians east of Homs, which was then followed by an attack on an American base in the northeast, killing one officer and at least 2 soldiers, which was then retaliated to by the Israeli attack. The US basically called Israel and said, just demonstrate what will happen if attacks on our bases continues. And what did Israel do? It targeted 6 sites inside Syria, killing majority civilians. So including members of such armed forces stationed in Turkey at the Incirlik Air Force Base, the Syrian Civil Defense, so this is the second mention of them, otherwise known as the White Helmets. It applauds the response to the earthquake tragedy by the United States government, applauds the civilians in Turkey and Syria who have selflessly volunteered to assist with response to the devastating aftermath, urges the international community to support. So here we have, again, heroic disaster response efforts in Turkey and Syria, but it's not in Syria, it's in Idlib, Al-Qaeda dominated, including those by the Syrian Civil Defense, the White Helmets, condemns efforts by the Assad regime, so we're back to this kind of lexicon, to cynically exploit the disaster to evade international pressure and accountability. So in other words, what they're claiming is the calls to lift the blockade, siege, and unilateral coercive measures against the Syrian people that are killing the Syrian people and have been since they were introduced, particularly the Caesar law under the Trump administration. They're now trying to lump the blame for that also on President Assad. And they claim that so Assad, prevented the United Nations from providing assistance through multiple border crossings between Turkey and Syria. This is a barefaced lie, because who more recently, since the earthquake, prevented entry through the Bab al-Hawa crossing, which is the only so-called humanitarian aid crossing open, was Turkey and the UN. And who prevented the humanitarian convoy coming from Damascus to Idlib to the Syrian people? So from President Assad, it was Abu Muhammad Jolani, the head of HTS. And why were the other humanitarian crossings shut down? Because they were running military weapons, aid, equipment into the armed groups in that northwestern pocket. So calls on the Biden administration to continue to use all diplomatic tools, including through the United Nations Security Council, to open all border crossings. Now, I mentioned this last week. So this means they want to increase the flow of weapons and equipment to the armed groups that are occupying northwest Idlib. Underscores the need for international assistance to reach northwest Syria, so only northwest Syria, to assist with disaster relief. Calls for an increased oversight mechanism to ensure that the United States funded assistance is not diverted for the benefit of the Assad regime. I struggle to even read that. The benefit of the Assad regime, 80% of the population lives under the protection of the government of Syria and the presidency of Syria. Urges the Biden administration to remain committed to the protection of the Syrian people, so the 80% of the population of Syria, by implementing the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2019. So this means preventing other nations coming to the assistance of Syria, because the Caesar Act basically penalizes any country that will supply goods, that will supply energy, fuel, oil, while the US, of course, is occupying Syrian resources. Let's see who voted for this. So 414 voted for. 414 members of Congress voted to continue the genocidal, sadistic sanctions against the Syrian people. 2 people voted against. No difference between Republican and Democratic. 214 Republican, 200 Democratic. Not voting, I assume that means abstained, 12 Democratic, 5 Republican. And as Natalie Baldwin of Consortium News and Antiwar.com mentioned, our House of Reps is filled with sadistic bastards, pardon my language, except for Massey and MTG. Only Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene voted against the resolution to maintain sanctions on Syria after the earthquake tragedy. Now, we know that the UK effectively, in this case at least, because UK intelligence, in my opinion, not only effectively incubated groups like the White Helmets, but they ran the intelligence operations, the Black Op against Syria since 2011, and even starting before that, of course. So how is the UK responding to the demands to lift sanctions? Here, and I know you've already shown this interview, Mike, but I think it's worth showing again. After what I've said about the US resolution that has just been passed. So this is Andrew Mitchell talking to the BBC about the potential that sanctions might be lifted.
Yeah, Vanessa, I do apologize. I just noticed a technical issue with that particular video, so we're not going to shoot. But we'll make sure under the show notes we will put a link to where people can watch that.
Okay. Well, I mean, basically, he's reiterating pretty much what the US is saying, of course, that that humanitarian aid is being received by the Northwest, and that as far as he's concerned, sanctions are not affecting the supply of that aid. Of course, sanctions have never affected supply of weapons, aid, equipment, financing to the regime change invested armed groups. So here again in the UK, and last week I mentioned King Charles, Sadiq Khan establishing the Syria tent in London. I think, Mike, you received a message, and I received a few messages from people that had gone to that tent to figure out what was going on, and told me that a huge amount of the money was going to be funneled to the White Helmets. So who is donating to this DEC, Disasters Emergency Committee Fund? None other than Will and Kate, King Charles himself, and Camilla. Who are DEC? Well, Disaster Emergency Committee brings together 15 leading aid charities at times of humanitarian crisis overseas, and it should be no surprise that they supported the COVID racket, that they came to prominence when Russia launched the special military operation against Ukraine. And let's look at some of the charities that are included under their umbrella. And so I can immediately point out CARE, the International Rescue Committee, which I think is David Miliband, Islamic Relief, Oxfam, British Red Cross, Save the Children's on there also, but I haven't included it in the slide. All of those organizations have been involved in the funding and support of subsidiary NGOs that are working alongside the armed groups in Syria, including the White Helmets. So on the 23rd of February, after 2 weeks, they announced that they had raised 100 million. Again, this will only be going into the Northwest, controlled by Al-Qaeda. And a lot of people have been contacting me to say, well, how can we figure out whether an NGO is genuine, whether it is sending aid to all of Syria? Ask them. Because if they are not affected by the sanctions, I would suggest they're only sending aid into the Northwest. Ask them if they're sending into other areas of Syria, and if they claim that they are doing so, ask them if they're working directly with the Syrian government, or if not, who are they working with? Keep asking questions, and if you get answers, please send them to UK Column. If a fundraiser is using celebrity cult pushes for their fund, you can almost automatically assume that this is not going to be helping the bulk of the Syrian people. Now, I touched on last week on what do the West and Israel want to do in Syria. Please do go to my Substack and watch the latest interview I did with ConvoCouch, where I actually talk about the post-earthquake roadmap for Syria according to Western hegemons. And of course, within that, I include Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are now also pouring money into the West. Everyone is seeing this, the earthquake tragedy, as an opportunity to revive their agenda. Now, what is their agenda? Looking at this map, I apologize. I had to do it very quickly this morning. But I wanted to just give people an idea, because I know when I'm talking about places in Syria, it's very hard to follow exactly what I mean. So if we go from the west of Syria, the northwest, the Idlib pocket that I'm talking about, and of course, Al-Qaeda doesn't control all of Idlib. The southern area is now back under the control of the Syrian Arab Army. But if we then go eastwards, so if we imagine all of Idlib being under the control of Al-Qaeda, that means Abu Muhammad Julani, who is the US and one can assume by default the UK asset in Idlib. But then if we go eastwards, you have Aleppo. Now, Turkey has, from the beginning of this conflict, had Aleppo in its sights. In 2012, the Tawhid Brigade was the armed group that invaded the industrial and residential and suburban areas of Aleppo and took control. And they were under the leadership of Turkey. If we continue eastwards, so the Turkish presence continues all along that northern border on the pretense, of course, of protecting itself against the US-backed Kurdish Contras. And if you imagine that black line dropping down to the red line, so eating up a huge amount of, I think it's about 30,000 square kilometers of Syrian territory, until you get over to the northeast, which is currently occupied by the United States, again, following the black line down. This is all under US control, and they are still, even post-earthquake, stealing Syrian oil and exporting it into Iraq, into Turkey, and eventually to Israel. You then come to the Al Bukamal, which is consistently between Iraq and Syria, which is consistently bombed by both the United States and Israel. Why? Because that is the only opening between Iraq and Syria that is allowing humanitarian aid, food, oil from Iran in particular, from Iran through Iraq and into Syria to the Syrian people. So that's the only opening on this border. Continue down the black line to Al Tanif, which is the largest American military illegal base in Syria, which has a 55-kilometer exclusion zone around it imposed by the US, in which they recruit, train, and equip armed groups, including ISIS. If you head kind of northwest from Al Tanif, you'll see the red blob there, which was the latest ISIS attack on civilians, killing 53 civilians and kidnapping dozens to the east of Homs. So you can see quite easily who is controlling those ISIS operations. Continue the black line down to Sweda. Now, this is where those red circles that I've sort of linked across to the Lebanese border, this is where Israel perceives that it wants to increase its influence by using the Druze community in Sweda. They already have control of Walid Jumblat's Druze community in Lebanon. In Dara, the US has been re-releasing ISIS operatives in Dara. There are current Syrian Arab Army operations to try and get rid of them in Dara and in Quneitra. So effectively, the US and Israel see a line going across from the end of the black line across all the red blobs to Lebanon, where there is actually an air base in that area on the border with Lebanon, and taking control of all of this territory. Now, I'm not saying that they are going to succeed, but what this shows you is the very big threat to Syria now, particularly with the influx of weapons and financing to the armed groups in the northern regions. And effectively, what it's looking at doing, and Victoria Newland spoke about the annexation of the northeast as the autonomous region under the control of the Kurdish countries. So Syria will effectively gradually be shrunken down into a central state, with the only friendly border being their Mediterranean coast and with Lebanon. And of course, Lebanon has been put into economic freefall. Syed Nasrallah is talking about this, and he is effectively currently threatening the US and Israel that if they continue with this policy, in his words, there will be inconceivable ramifications for both the US and for Israel. So the situation is returning to a sort of high intensity conflict at the moment. Then I want to come back to the fact that we mentioned last week the white helmets and their heavy equipment that they apparently claim they don't have, and that's why all of the financing is coming into them. Now, I just want to ask a question here. This was a tweet put out by Riyad al-Saleh in the last couple of days. The White Helmets teams preparing roads and floors for sheltering camps for earthquake survivors in the city of Jindara, so just to the north of Aleppo. Let's have a look at the photo. I mean, let's remark on the heavy equipment that they appear to have. But to me, Mike and Pat, this looks very much like the preparation of a runway. I could be wrong, but it would be very strategically placed just to the north of Aleppo on the basis that the West is looking to retake that territory, and potentially it's certainly in their roadmap to have control of Aleppo. And then finally, I want to draw people's attention to the End the Siege campaign, which has been put together across 14 countries: Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, Yemen, Tunisia, Canada, Morocco, Lebanon, Algeria, UK, Slovakia, Ireland, Germany, and the US. There is an event in California, in LA. For further details, you can freeze frame. That's the email address, the Facebook page, the Twitter account. And on Saturday, the 4th of March, please go. There is an End the Siege event in London opposite 10 Downing Street. Please go if you can. Please try to be there in as big numbers as possible to show your disgust at the continued genocide of the Syrian people. And I'm not using that term lightly.
Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for that. Now, let's move on. If you like what the UK Column does, you would like to support us, please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. There are options to help us out there. You can pick something up at the UK Column shop, but please do share material you find on the various platforms, including Vanessa's report when she puts it out on her channels as well. And I just also want to mention that Children's Health Defence tomorrow are holding a symposium called The Attack on Food Plus Solutions to Fight Back. Joseph Mercola, Stephanie Seneff, James Corbett, Zen Honeycutt, Patrick Wood, Thomas Massey, Representative Thomas Massey, and many others. Meryl Nass hosting that. You can watch that at chd.tv. Well, I would encourage everybody to get onto that tomorrow if you're not out and about or at the event that Vanessa's talking about. Now that starts at 12 p.m. Eastern time, so that's 5 p.m. UK time. So you should be able to do both if you're in London. No problem with that. So would encourage, and there we go. Now let's move on, Patrick, to the lab leak story, because it's now starting to hit the headlines once again. It's being pushed pretty hard. Let's have a look at CNBC from the 26th of February. Their headline said, U.S. Energy Department assesses with low confidence COVID may have originated from Chinese lab leak. So that was their coverage of the...
A classified report delivered to key lawmakers.
Yes, indeed. How did the Wall Street Journal, cover it? They said lab leak most likely origin of COVID-19 pandemic. Said the Energy Department. Well, this is a bit strange. How can one be saying that the Energy Department said they had low confidence in that, and the other saying, well, it's definitive? Fox, of course, they had something to say. COVID leaked from a Wuhan lab, full stop, not a question mark. So that's a definitive statement. Here's how we hold China and Fauci accountable. And here's another one. COVID came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So the question...
And he said, the author, Brad, this is a popular blog, by the way, he says, I'll bet my life on it.
Yeah.
So Brad's bet his life on it. Brad at Substack there, Euphoric Recall.
So the question is, who's pushing this narrative? Well, let's go back to Fox again and a little piece of video. Well, just have a watch of this.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan. Here, you're talking about a potential leak from a Chinese government-controlled lab that killed millions of Americans.
So it's all potential. It's all potential, but nonetheless, that potentiality and low confidence allows to have definitive headlines and stories in the press.
First question, Mike, why is the Department of Energy opining on a microscopic biological pandemic issue? First question. Second question, the most discredited and politicized agency in the United States government right now is guess who?
The Department of Energy?
No, it'll be the the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Oh, well, that one?
The
right,
FBI.
Okay.
So, like, why are they involved in this? I mean, they don't have a crack team of people scrubbing up virus particles or anything like that. Mike, the timing of this just smacks of politics. It seems like Washington's decided this is going to be the narrative. It's going to be lab leak or lab release. Leave everybody guessing as to which that might be. And then we're going to move forward and sort of use this as the new scapegoat for COVID, for countermeasures, for everything? Well,
the scores on the doors, Patrick, are that if you went back to 2021, of the 9 U.S. intelligence agencies, 6, the assessment from 6 of them was that it was natural transmission. 1 was for lab leak, and 2 were undecided. And we move forward to 2023. And now it's, according to the Wall Street Journal, it's this low confidence one, but it's now been changed to 5, 2, and 2. So it's definitely an effort, it seems, to get intelligence agencies to move in this direction.
Are you getting a WMD vibe off this, Mike?
We're coming to that. So look, let's see what the Chinese had to say.
The FBI has...
Sorry. Here's Mao Ling, and she said this. China strongly opposes political manipulation of the origins tracing issue in any form. Putting the intelligence community in charge for a matter of science is a clear sign that the issue has been politicized. She went on to say, given the US intelligence community's track record of making up stories, there is little, if any, credibility in their conclusions. And I think this is a very fair point. Now, I just want to make this point as well. Who has been pushing the lab leak story as hard as he possibly can in the UK for the last two years? That is none other than Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6.
Interesting.
This is what he had to say some time ago. I do not think that this pandemic started as an accident. It raises the issue if China were ever to admit their responsibility. Does it pay reparations? So, right? This is how far the...
Well, the reparations talking point, that's what neocons and Republicans are saying in the United States now. Trillions in reparations for the damage to the U.S. economy they want China to pay.
So he was pushing this 2 years ago. I think it will make every country in the world rethink how it treats its relationship with China. The People's Republic of China is a pretty terrifying regime and does some things we consider unacceptable and extreme in silencing opposition to the official line of the government. The hypocrisy in this is unbelievable. We don't know that's what's happened, but a lot of data has probably been destroyed or made to disappear, so it's going to be difficult to prove. Definitely the case for a gain of function chimera being the cause of the pandemic. We'll come on to that a little later. This is why scientific analysis is now so important, because although that can't prove the case 100%, the thorough biochemical analysis puts the weight of evidence to this being a man-made lab experiment, a natural virus that's been enhanced. China was originally let off the hook. I think the problem was the style of the Trump regime. A lot of people understandably found it hard to go along with his more outlandish allegations. But here's the thing. Patrick, we have been accused of being mouthpieces for Russian narratives. Undoubtedly, some will accuse us of being mouthpieces for China narratives here. But my question to you and to everybody that's watching this is, how many times have we been hoodwinked by the intelligence community and encouraged through politicized mechanisms? The intelligence community has lied to us time after time after time. Let's just
they're the dog whistle, aren't they? They dog whistle to the press. They dog whistle to partisans in politics. This is what they've been doing consistently.
But it's more than that. It's more than that, isn't it? Because if we look at Richard Dearlove in particular, he's been pushing Russiagate.
Well, it's right there. Orbis Business Intelligence. That's the source of all this stuff, isn't it? Christopher Steele, Stefan Halper, Alexander Downer, Lexi Downer, Joseph Mifsud, and of course Felix Sater, all pointing their finger, and they ended up getting George Papadopoulos banged up for nothing.
And so how many of these people are pushing China lab leak narratives? I'm pretty sure most of them.
Well, a lot of them have disappeared into the shadows because of the embarrassment of Russiagate falling to pieces as a official conspiracy theory. But give it time, Mike. I'm sure Christopher Steele will be able to draft a paper on this one.
Absolutely. Let's not forget that it was Richard Dearlove that brought us into a war with Iraq through the yellow cake nonsense.
Fancy that. Look at that.
And we should not ever forget that, of course, the same types of people were behind Integrity Initiative and also the Skripal nonsense, which has brought us into a conflict in Ukraine at the moment. And if you want to see how ridiculous the story of Skripal is, have a look at this article on the UK Column website. So my point here is, that's the day of the Skripal if you're just listening. But my point here is, we've been duped time and time again by these types of people and by Richard Dearlove specifically. And we shouldn't allow ourselves to be duped into a coming war with China on the basis of something which is unproven, unprovable, and, well, we're going to come on to the gain of function bit now, I suppose.
Well, the key was that Christopher Wray clip. Okay, he said this virus has killed millions of people. This lab leak virus has killed millions of Americans. That is a specific U.S. government and establishment talking point. Remember that. It's killed millions. There's no proof yet of any super virus out of the Wuhan lab, not out in nature, not even from the lab itself.
Right.
And also there's huge questions, Mike, isn't it, about these claims about all these lofty COVID death figures, right? There's problems with the PCR test. This has been thoroughly debunked as a totally fraudulent assay. It's not a diagnostic test. It's been used to jack up data on COVID cases and deaths, plus the changing of death certificates, filling out comorbidities, all these directives that came from the WHO because of the state of emergency that jacked up all the COVID deaths. And they, not only that, they kept the meter running, didn't they, for COVID deaths?
They certainly did.
They normally cap it off after a season, but they just kept it running for 3 years. So you got a big, giant number. So isn't this interesting? This is how the communications, how the talking points are shaping up on this. So there's some big influencers who are also pushing lab leak now. They're giddy with excitement. Here's one of them, Robert Malone himself. Has come out to the gates, and they're staking their whole reputations, Mike, as scientists and whistleblowers, I guess, on this whole thing. So here's what Robert Malone has said on Twitter yesterday. The lab leak killed millions of people. Is this something you can prove yet or scientifically? I'm not sure. It looks like a political
statement.
Talking point. It does. It's exactly what Christopher Wray said, the discredited director of the FBI. Anyway, most likely this research was done by the U.S. government through EcoHealth and the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. This is identical to Fox News talking points here. So why is the U.S. government and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and the National Institute of Health still funding WIV and EcoHealth? Why is the International Court of Justice in The Hague not investigating? Give me a break, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which the U.S. is not even a signatory to, but let's just put that aside. Robert Malone, so he's staking his whole reputation now on lab leak, and he's making most likely claims. So he's saying the lab leak killed millions, but most likely the research. So he doesn't seem too clear on his statement either. Who else is opining on this? Brett Weinstein. And by the way, I think Brett Weinstein's amazing. However, on this, I think he's playing a little funny game. So I made a statement on Twitter with Glenn Greenwald. I had a little dialogue with Glenn on this. And by the way, Glenn's very reasonable on this issue. But Brett Weinstein using his massive Twitter following to try to crush me with his hundreds of thousands or million followers or whatever he's got. Evaluating the evidence is not guessing. And an engineered super virus isn't even possible, he says. But what evidence clearly does suggest is that the lab enhancement of a wild virus, one with no innate capacity for human-to-human transmission, into a highly contagious human pathogen. Isn't he describing a super virus, which he says isn't possible in the previous sentence? So Brett Weinstein's contradicting himself there in order to sort of destroy me for challenging the lab leak, which is very popular in the internet, what do they call it? The intellectual dark web, the IDW, this crowd on Twitter. So this is interesting. So the influencers are all behind the lab leak or lab release as well. So, and it gets interesting. I still haven't got a reply from Brett Weinstein yet, still waiting. And here we go. Glenn Greenwald is kind of straddling the fence on this, watching the media corporations and their liberal allies grapple with the Wall Street Journal's revelations is fascinating. They have no way out. Fauci told them COVID's zoonotic origin was proven and lab leak theory debunked. They all repeated this for 18 months and now know it was untrue. Now, this is a...
Do they know it? I don't think they do.
I don't think they do. And how can you debunk something?
And of course, the lab leak story says that Fauci was involved in the research. So what he's effectively doing there is attempting to put some credibility on the whole narrative.
Yeah, he is. He's basically saying because it was denied by the media that somehow that's proof that it's a legitimate theory, but it's still a theory. And we'll show you why it's still a theory in a second here. And even Jay Bhattacharya is staking his reputation on lab leak. He's released tons of tweets on this. Fantastic timeline, says Jay Bhattacharya here from Stanford University. Great Barrington Declaration, and he's a great guy as well. I think these are all great guys. I think they're just wrong on this. He's saying the leak hypothesis from a putative conspiracy to legitimate science, says Jay Bhattacharya. Great Barrington Declaration.
We need to see the science.
These are big influencers here. So they're all rallying around this theory, and they're sure that it's the case. They're sure that it's happening here. And here's Vivek Ramaswamy. He's running for president on the Republican ticket. He's your sort of Andrew Yang, Republican-style Andrew Yang, tech entrepreneur, fund manager, really good on the ESGs and opposing the Great Reset. He's saying there's no justice without accountability. We now know COVID-19 started in a Chinese lab, says Vivek Ramaswamy. We must unapologetically hold accountable the culprits who lied about both in the US and in China. I'll discuss this more on Mornings Maria. So he's on Fox News opining on this as well here, Mike. So this is interesting. They're all lining up. Everybody's got a consensus on this. So isn't this interesting? All these rebels who position themselves as rebels, suddenly they believe the U.S. government now this week, and they're all backing the U.S. government's official conspiracy theory. The irony of this is just too much to ignore, Mike. And so let's take a look at this lab leak situation. And this is the arguments that are being constructed here. So it must be true. The lab leak must be true because Department of Energy and the U.S. government sources say it might be low confidence, high confidence, not sure. Not sure here. So here's what people are saying, but Fauci's emails. So there was these leaked emails from Fauci, remember that?
Yes.
And they're saying, because they mentioned the furin cleavage site, and then Fauci said it could be a lab leak or whatever. So is that evidence of a lab leak?
No.
It's evidence of emails by Fauci is what it is. It doesn't actually prove a lab leak, a lab release, or anything. We're still looking for the virus, Mike. We still can't find this super virus. Next, but the MSM and big tech were censoring lab leak early in 2020. Well, there's two reasons why they're doing that, which are well known by now. One is because Trump was touting China virus on every press conference, and so big tech went into full damage control mode and wanted to shut down that talking point.
Yeah, but that was in the United States. In the UK, in the meantime, they were all, citing the reports from Richard Dearlove.
From Dearlove. Okay, so in the UK was a different thing
going on here.
So that kind of blows this defense out of the water, doesn't it?
Right.
So, and I personally think, Mike, that early in the so-called pandemic, the government, big tech, and we now know that government was directing big tech censorship because of the Twitter files. They wanted people focused on lockdowns, social distancing, masks, rule of six, all working from home, vaccine coming up, they're getting ready for the vaccine rollout. So they didn't want to confuse the narrative, I think, early on.
Right.
So that it makes sense. Now they're happy. The vaccine rollout's falling apart. It's a debacle. Now comes lab leak. Now the government in 2023 are backing lab leak. Now the timing is right for that government official conspiracy theory now to go into the mainstream media in order to deflect from the disaster that's COVID policies and a disastrous vaccine rollout. And so here's the next. But the NIH, Fauci's agency, the NIAID, they funded gain of research in Wuhan. That's evidence of what? It's evidence of funding gain of research. It's not evidence. We still haven't found this super virus. Where is the super virus? We don't know. And where is the gain of function results? Has anybody published any gain of function results? We'll show you that in a minute, because there seems to be nothing in the world of virology. So this is hugely, I think, over-exaggerated the significance of gain of function. It's a great talking point, though, and it's driving the Twitter sphere, it's driving the media crazy on this here. And here's another one. But Peter Daszak and Eco Health Alliance were looking for bat coronaviruses near Wuhan. Is that evidence of a super virus or a lab leak? No, it's evidence of Eco Health Alliance, who are creaming in millions and millions of dollars hunting for viruses around the world, in Vietnam, in China, in Africa, and they're backed by the pharmaceutical industry, they're backed by the US government. They have the power to help declare, quote, pandemics. And we all know how lucrative it is when you have the power to declare pandemics. Would you say, Mike, there's a lot of well-heeled stakeholders that benefit from pandemics?
Just a few.
Would you say? So we need to look at Eco Health Alliance and Peter Daszak, who's an interesting, not a scientist, he's British, and he seems to be in the interesting catbird seat there, making all this work. Maybe he's reading the same stuff John Dearlove's reading. I don't know, but we're just spitballing there. So anyway, so when you see the arguments, we're just saying to people, look, these are logical fallacies. They don't prove anything. And we'll show you how bad this gets in just a second here. This is a good article by the Off Guardian, Kit Knightley. Headline, no, COVID still doesn't come from a lab. And what the point he makes here, Mike, is if you buy lab leak, you then endorse all of the COVID policies. And it lets the government off the hook, because they'll say, well, we secretly knew it was a China virus, a lab leak, and we did everything we can to protect our people. And Big Pharma gets off the hook because they say, well, we rushed the vaccine, but we tried. You see? So lab leak is like the cure, the long-term cure for all the rampant failures of government and all the reckless policies. So it does get them off the hook, and it opens the door for more of the same in the future, if you believe in this. Not only that, and it opens the door for a new war on bioterror, a war on bioterror. So a whole gravy train of biosurveillance, militarized applications, DARPA projects. The UK and the US will probably lead in that, like they did in the war on terror, okay, which is we're still stuck with all the war on terror, Department of Homeland Security, all of that.
And of course, it also drives the narrative that China is an enemy to be feared. And by the way, we're heading to war with China within the next 5 or 6 years. So don't worry about that.
So does anybody think maybe the United States kind of duped and set up China there by planting those little projects?
I think it's a possibility.
I think it's a strong possibility. So here, look at this. Even, okay, now this is J.J. Coe. Now he was the founder of Drastic. They were a pandemic information and data analysis group early on that got good traction in the U.S. mainstream media. So he's a mainstream biogeneticist guy in the U.S., okay, fairly high level. And he's basically saying, he's backing off the lab leak theory. He's saying that it's not plausible at all because gain of function is completely overblown. He said you can't do all the things that they're claiming theoretically that gain of function does. And so this is an interesting piece. That's Michael Sanger, who's also very, I think, pretty even-handed as a pundit. He's right up there with Mark Changizi in that sort of team reality group there on social media. And this is on Substack, The New Normal. Michael Sanger, good column there. Interesting take here. So that's a mainstream virology guy saying lab leak. And he's also saying the PCR test was basically ridiculous and it ramped up all the cases. So all the things that we're saying, this person's saying, and some of his colleagues are saying the same. So the breach in the narrative here is interesting. And look at this. So the gain of function, if you want to know about gain of function, I recommend, this is Dr. Sam Beeley, Gain of Function Gaslighting. Go to her website. This is a great introductory video. It shows you that the 1 or 2 experiments that they hang the whole gain of function theory on, the methodology on them were completely fraudulent, and they didn't even do control experiments, and they ended up killing all the animals, the mice and the ferrets. And then they wrote down, because the animals died of being injected with all these different things, they said it must be a supervirus. So the fraud on some of these experiments is now being exposed. And then also this one, gain of function garbage, that's the sort of sequel to that one. And she really just lays it out in a way that I don't think anybody else has done. And all of these are footnoted with all of the scientific papers, Mike. So the notes on these and the footnotes on these videos are, you know, absolutely comprehensive. So if you want to check that out. And so think about this for a minute. And you remember this slide that we introduced when we talked about the Department of Defense front-running this whole operation. That was at the end of January, I believe, and out of BARDA. So this was a DoD operation. So think about this. They have total liability, accountability shield because it's a military operation, no congressional oversight, the PrEP Act to protect it. And so all they have to do now is come and say, well, it was a biological threat from China, and we knew it. And so this is why, so we justify all of these things, rushing the vaccine, skipping FDA normal approvals, forget about safe and effective. We're sorry about that. Forget about informed consent. These were countermeasures to counter a Chinese virus from a lab. It justifies the whole military shape of the pandemic countermeasures. And we know that it's a military operation because all this has been released and is now public now, or known in the public anyway, Mike, in just the last couple of weeks. So, and if you want more details on this, you go to this really good article here by Freddie Ponton about the military rollout of Operation Warp Speed, and the UK and Europe were part of that, and we'll talk about that next week. NATO's role in the vaccine rollout here. Our COVID-19 vaccines and military biodefense response gone terribly wrong? Well, I think the answer is starting to make itself known now.
Okay, so one of the other big stories in the UK press at the moment, Patrick, is Manchester Arena bombing. And so here's the Daily Mail. Security services could have stopped Manchester Arena attack if they acted on intelligence, and bomber's own family holds significant responsibility for his radicalization, damning report finds.
This is one of those 5-year waits, isn't it? The typical inquiry, got a retired judge fronting this. And of course, it's like we didn't do enough. We should have done more surveillance. We should have acted on intelligence. We should have invoked our prevent strategy. We could have saved lives in Manchester. That's the narrative after a 5-year inquiry, Mike. So people have waited 5 years for this. And let's just dig a little bit deeper here. And it becomes less impressive the deeper you go. So none of Salman Beatty's family, his parents or older brothers, or etc., they didn't cooperate, not surprisingly, with the public inquiry. So Beeley, this is the alleged bomber here, or the bomber, 22 at the time of the bombing, and Hashem, I believe that's his brother, 2 years junior, who were jailed for life for his part in the plot, had both traveled from their home in South Manchester with their father in Libya during the Libyan War in 2011. So during the civil war there, they were likely to be involved in fighting. They were involved in fighting.
Sorry, were they fighting on the side that we were supporting?
Correct.
Aha.
Correct. On NATO's side.
Right.
So they were part of the sort of Al-Qaeda brigades and the extremists that NATO and David Cameron had organized to topple Gaddafi. So the father, Ramadan Abedi, instilled in his sons extremist views, says the inquiry, okay, and encouraged them to put those views into practice when he exposed them into training with the combat alongside Islamist militants.
Again, these were the Islamist militants that we were supporting.
These are ISIS, embryonic ISIS cells plus Al-Qaeda. Many of these fighters were then repatriated to Syria after Gaddafi was toppled. That's who these guys were running around with. And the British government were fully aware of it. NATO's fully aware of it, and we'll show you that as well. So Sir John, this is the head of the inquiry, Sir John's report, it is possible that had either of them been referred to the government's anti-terror scheme PREVENT, there may have been some positive benefit. You got to be kidding me. Okay, isn't PREVENT supposed to pick up signals, right, of radicalization? Were there any signals in advance? Well, let's take a look. So that's what the report's saying. If they would have been referred to PREVENT, it would have saved lives and de-radicalized them. But this is completely contradicted by the facts. So we're questioning this inquiry that, what is this, a whitewash? Because look at this, Mike. Manchester bombing timeline, how the bomber was on MI5's radar 20 times before the bombing. Was this not enough from 2010 to trigger the PREVENT mechanism, right? So look at this. This starts in 2010. He's on their radar. All these Operation Camellia. He's been flagged through all of these different operations by the security services. And reading this, it's so comprehensive. Hanging out with ISIS recruiters here, caught up in text message groups, going to and fro, plus the trips to Libya, back again. Mike, what does this look like?
Well, it reminds me a lot of events that take place in the United States where you know, mass shooters are known to the FBI and so on. All these people seem to be agents of various agencies.
They're on the radar.
They're
right?
on the radar, or they're somehow linked to the agencies directly.
So they're not lone wolves, they're known wolves. Okay, so here's another known wolf. It's Salman Abedi and his brother as well. It just goes on and on. Look at this, 20 different things where they were sort of reported, flagged,
right,
under surveillance. I mean, to say this report is so disingenuous. It's really too much. So look at this. Now here's a different viewpoint. This is from Mark Curtis, Declassified UK. This is months before, when he had the pre-report before the final publication. And this is what he had to say. Salman Abedi was never subject to controls on his movements to Libya before his 2017 bombing that murdered 22 people, despite a stream of intelligence showing his contacts with extremists. So basically free to go to and fro, in and out of UK and Libya. It gets worse. Also remarkable is that Ramadan, the father, and Ismail Abedi were, in 2011 and 2015 respectively, subject to port stops in the UK by security services who downloaded extremist material from the Abedi's mobile devices, but they were still allowed to travel back and forth between the UK and Libya. Isn't that interesting? Did they have some kind of special status? Were they involved in some special groups? Were they working for, you know, clandestine agencies? Were they informants? Were they fighters? I mean, obviously they're one of the above. The security services did nothing to stop and reportedly encouraged British Libyan radicals such as the Abedis to fight against Muammar Gaddafi's regime in the war in Libya to topple him in 2011, Mike. And so this is interesting. Here's the one we flagged. Look at this. Dominic Scally, Manchester Greater Police, told the inquiry the national priority was Syria, and for every individual who traveled to Syria, we had a plan for how they were going to receive them back where they are. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? So that's the Organization of Foreign Fighters from the UK. Certainly that's what it looks like. He didn't mean to say that, but he sort of said the quiet part out loud, Mike. So, but Libya, he said, was a very different matter. For those who had legitimate reasons to travel there, I'm not aware of us necessarily tracking any Libyan fighters.
And yet they were stopped, and their phones, they had material downloaded from their phones. So how is he not aware of that?
So clearly this is a laissez-faire policy. And mind you, many of the Libyan fighters went to fight in Syria. That's a fact that's omitted from this as well. But here, look at this. Abdullah's lawyers wrote, it is important to remember that participation in the Libyan revolution against Gaddafi's regime was never regarded as terrorism by the British government. Isn't that an incredible statement? Nobody from the UK who fought in the Libyan, quote, revolution against Gaddafi's regime has been prosecuted for terrorist offenses upon their return to the UK, even though they were working in sort of Al-Qaeda and ISIS cells, so known Islamist extremist cells. Isn't that not an extraordinary statement? And look at this. So we go back a little further, and Manchester bomber was a UK ally. This is Mark Curtis again. So the father was clearly part of the NATO rebel groups, okay? So with direction and command and control from NATO and probably the UK Army as well. So I mean, this is well documented by now. And on top of that, I just want to remind people, a year before the Manchester bombing in 2017, they did a live terrorist drill at the Trafford Center with crisis actors. Take a look at this video.
Frighteningly realistic. A shopping centre in Manchester transformed into our worst nightmare. The scene of a terror attack. This blood and these screams, fake here though. Emergency services taking part in a major anti-terror exercise overnight at the Trafford Centre. Armed with machine guns, officers testing their response to a potential Paris or Brussels type attack on British soil. A threat at the forefront of so many minds. The hundreds involved knew they were in no danger, but still howled in distress during the role play. Greater Manchester Police, the North West Counter-Terrorism Unit and the North West Ambulance Service being tested, none knowing exactly how the mock attack would unfold. Authorities have stressed there is no threat looming here, but that they need to be ready for every eventuality. And with the UK on high alert to a possible terror attack, exercises like this could hold the key to saving countless lives.
Amazing.
Countless lives saved with those types of exercises.
It's all about saving lives. That's why we do these mock attacks. We hire the crisis actors and the blood and the gore, the whole lot, to save lives. So they went through all of that effort in Manchester, right in the identical vicinity of this terrorist attack a year before. A, it didn't do anything to stop it. B, the government didn't do anything to stop the assailant who was on their radar no less than 20 times and who fought with terrorist groups in Libya. I mean, the whole thing doesn't look good. None of these conclusions come up in the inquiry, Mike. They published the report. It looks like a total whitewash.
Yes. Okay.
Amazing.
Well, look, a lot of people absolutely concerned about the numbers of immigrants coming into this country and being put up in the UK at the moment. And the question is, where are they coming from? What is the actual problem that they're leaving their home countries for? But I just wanted to put this on screen. Now, we missed this at the time, and I want to say thanks to Vanessa for sending this through to me earlier today. This is from the 2nd of March, 2023. So I suppose that was only yesterday. But anyway, hands off UK aid for the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries, demands the International Development Committee. The government must put the UK's old budget beyond the reach of Home Office and ring fence it to spend in the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries, the International Development Committee has urged today. Now, why would the Home Office be getting access to international development money? This is what I can't work out, or couldn't work out at first glance anyway, because of course the Home Office is nothing to do with international development, and this the international development money is managed by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Agency. So let's just have a look and see what this says. In a searingly concise report of 14 paragraphs, the committee sets out the evidence to demonstrate that the world's poorest countries are being shortchanged as a result of other government departments raiding the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's aid budget. Meanwhile, the aid budget has been cut to 0.55% of gross national income, and aid programs which support the world's poorest people overseas have been disproportionately cut, despite the committee's attempts to seek information through parliamentary questions, written evidence, and an evidence session featuring ministers from HM Treasury, the Home Office and FCDO. The government has refused to provide up-to-date statistics on how it spends aid in the UK. This is aid that's supposed to go outside the UK, is being spent in the UK.
Foreign aid.
Foreign aid. Parliament cannot adequately hold the government to account when the information provided is, quotes, woefully inadequate and willfully opaque, says MPs. So let's look at a paragraph from the report itself. This is talking about aid spending on refugees in the UK. The use of the term refugees is not necessarily appropriate here. They're certainly immigrants, but whether they're refugees, I don't think is proven. And what it says here, in 2021, the most recent year for which data are available, the government spent more than £1 billion of the aid budget on in-country refugee costs. That unprecedented expenditure accounted for almost 10% of the total overseas development aid budget, which exceeded the percentage of ODA allocated to any other sector. In 2021, ODA spending was reduced on the health, humanitarian, and education sectors, while in-country refugee costs was the only category in which expenditure increased. In 2020, the government spent 4.3% of the ODA budget on in-country refugee costs, compared with 2% in 2015. In 2021, the Home Office spending from the aid budget on refugees in the UK increased to almost £1 billion, of which more than half was spent on, quotes, initial accommodation.
I.e. hotels.
Now, of course, exactly, we have seen so many video clips and so many protests and so many discussions about refugees stroke immigrants being held in 5-star, 4-star hotels in the UK.
Mercure in Exeter, 4-star hotel,
Exactly.
is full of Afghan.
And people asking why. Now we know what's going on. £1 billion spent in 2021 on this. I'm sure it was more in 2022, and goodness knows what 2023 is going to be like. Vanessa, what are your thoughts? You're muted.
First of all, there was a former BBC journalist put out the immigration by nationality, and Albanians are well up on the list, which concurs with many of the reports coming in of 4-star, 5-star hotels being requisitioned by predominantly young male fighting age Albanian immigrants. But it also crosses my mind, Mike, that when we're asking for transparency on on billions of taxpayer funds being sent to international so-called humanitarian zones, etc., are they kind of throwing the responsibility back at the Home Office here and saying, well, it's not us, don't ask us to demonstrate how we're spending taxpayers' money abroad when the Home Office is effectively stealing it all for immigration and refugees? That's what kind of came to my mind when I first skimmed through that this morning. It's a bit of an internal struggle, and they're basically trying. It's a bit when they threw James Le Mesurier of the White Helmets under the bus for embezzling 50,000, when in reality a lot of that funding, and there's a huge number of examples like this. Adam Smith International, Actis. Are they trying to find a way to wriggle out of providing transparency over the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, for example, and over UK FSDO funding abroad?
Yeah, Good questions.
My personal experience with this, Mike, with the hotel in Exeter was, the hotel was 4-star, full of Afghan families, whole families. It was full basically. So I was a little bit shocked, as was the colleague I was with, and that. So, and one of the explanations for this is with the rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan. The United States and Britain, all of their loyalists, everyone working for NGOs, anybody working as a translator, anybody working alongside or with NATO or any group or whatever, all these people were promised safe haven outside of Afghanistan. So, and I think they're having to deliver on that. Not only that, this is also the future opposition government from when we go back to bomb and reinvade Afghanistan, and it's almost certain that the West will at some point, because that's a key juncture on Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So it's a familiar pattern, Mike, which is bomb, invade, and then take as many, create a brain drain, take the middle class, any kids, run them through British, U.S. universities, get them into NGOs, and set them up for a future in politics, either in Europe or the West, or back to form the future of Afghanistan or Syria or Libya or Iraq, etc. So this is a familiar pattern. This is how you do empire in the 21st century.
Yeah.
That's how you erect and manage your fifth column overseas, prepare it to return to power after a regime change war.
And now we get a clue about how much money is actually being spent on this. Okay, look, we're well over time, so we've got to end there. I want to say thank you very much to Patrick and Vanessa for joining us today. We'll be back in a few minutes if you're a UK Column member for some extra, a couple of bits that we have to cover there. Otherwise, have a great weekend. We will see you at 1 p.m. as usual on Monday. See you then. Bye-bye.